Hello and welcome to Drunk on Tea. Today I'm going to show you how to paint this Minka Lesk model for your games of Warhammer 40K. So the first thing I've done is I've primed the model black, as this will give us a nice even base coat for the rest of our colours to work from. And the first thing I'm doing is I'm coming in with Xandri dust. I'm going to paint all of the clothing on the model. Keep your paint nice and thin and work in a couple of layers and catch all of the fabric on her tunic and her trousers with a couple of layers of Xandri dust. Now this paint isn't going to give fantastic coverage on the first layer, but by working in a couple of smooth even coats we'll build up to a nice solid colour of Xandri dust all over her uniform. Make sure you catch any areas of fabric that you can find on the model, like these parts here sticking out from her shoulders and the collar as well. And after the first coat you can see it's still very patchy coverage, so I'm coming back in with a second layer of Xandri dust and building this up to a nice solid colour all over that fabric. If after the second coat still a little bit patchy, come back in with a third or even fourth coat of Xandri dust till we build up to a nice solid base layer all over the fabric. And after a couple of layers you can see I've built up to a nice smooth cover of Xandri dust all over her uniform. And now with some Caliban green I'm going to come in and paint all of the armour. So it'll be all these armour panels here, like on her chest. Just going to catch these with a couple of layers of Caliban green. Once again the first coat's not going to give fantastic coverage, but by coming back in with a second layer we'll build up to a solid colour all over this armour. I'm also going to catch these pads here on her knees, as well as the shoulder pads, just catching all of these with a couple of layers of Caliban green. And I'm also going to catch the casing to a bolt pistol as well. Just make sure you catch all these areas with a couple of layers of Caliban green. And after a couple of layers you can see we've built up to a nice solid colour of Caliban green all over the armour and the casing to a bolt pistol. So now the next step is I'm going to come in and paint all of the skin on the model. So for this I'm using Bugman's Glow. I'm going to catch all the areas of her face and hands. Be nice and neat at this stage when around the areas that we've already painted with other colours. Just make sure you catch all of the exposed skin with a couple of layers of Bugman's Glow. So there's the face, and she's also got her hands and this arm where her sleeves rolled up, so make sure you catch these with a couple of layers of Bugman's Glow. And after a couple of layers of Bugman's Glow, we've picked out the skin on the model. So next up with some Rhinox hide, I'm going to come in and paint any of the leather areas on the model. So it'll be these areas here over her boots. Going to make sure I catch these with a couple of layers of Rhinox hide, being nice and neat when I'm around the Xandri dust. And also any pouches on her belt as well. I'm going to make sure I pick these out with a couple of layers of Rhinox hide. So this will be a nice base coat for painting the leather later. Now with all of those leather details picked out, the next thing I'm going to do is pick out a couple of the details on the model. So with some corn red, I'm going to come in and pick out the power pack for her power sword on her arm. Obviously being really neat when I'm around the other colours I've already painted. Just going to make sure I catch all of this power pack with a couple of layers of corn red. And with some MacLeod blue, I'm going to come in and paint the power cable to the power sword. These two colours will just work together to add some interest on the model and break up those colours we've already painted. And with the power pack and cable painted, the next thing I want to do is come in and paint any of the details I want to be black. So for this I'm using Corvus Black. I'm going to come in and put a layer of this over her boots, being careful around the rhinox hide, just making sure I catch the boots with a layer of Corvus Black. She's also got this band going around her leg, just going to make sure I catch this nice and carefully with a layer of Corvus Black. And also the scabbard for her power sword as well. I'm going to make sure I catch these areas with a couple of layers of Corvus Black. And now with some Mournfang Brown, I'm going to come in and paint her hair. So I'm going to be nice and careful when I'm around her face. I'm just going to make sure I get all of the exposed hair with a couple of layers of Mournfang Brown. She's got some bits on both sides of the bandage on her head. Make sure you catch the bits on top and below with some Mournfang Brown. And with those black details and the hair painted, the model's really starting to come together now. So now with some lead belcher, I'm going to come in and start painting some of the metallic details. So I'm going to catch all of the blades to her power sword. Just catching this with a couple of layers of lead belcher to build up to a nice solid silver colour. Also going to pick this exposed part here to the power pack. As well as any metallic parts to the gun as well. So it's these areas here around the back of the gun, the magazine casing and the muzzle. I'm going to catch all of these with a couple of layers of lead belcher. And finally, I'm just picking out this skull detail here on her belt just to add some interest. And with all of those areas picked out with some lead belcher, the next thing I'm going to paint is any gold details on the model. So for these gold details I'm using Retributor Armour, and this will be things like the handle here to the power sword, as well as the power node, catching these with a layer of Retributor Armour. And any of the detailing on her scabbard, I'm going to pick these areas out with a layer of Retributor Armour as well. Just be nice and careful when I'm around the other colours. And with that Retributor Armour applied, there's just one last base colour left to apply to the model, and that will be to pick out any areas that I want to be white. So for these areas I'm going to use Celestra Grey. To start off with, I'm going to paint the bandage going around her head, being nice and careful around the skin and the hair, making sure I only pick out these areas of bandage. And I'm also going to pick out the Aquila here on her chest, and there's also an Aquila on this part of the scabbard as well. I'm just going to pick these details out with a little bit of Celestra Grey. And with that Celestra Grey applied, there's all of the base coats applied to the model. Now it's time to start shading Minka. So the first shade, I'm coming in with some Agrax Earth Shade, and I'm going to apply this all over the areas we paint with Xandri Dust. I'm going to thin this down with just a little bit of water, so it's not so strong. I'm just going to apply it all over these areas of fabric, so it'll sink into the recesses, darken those areas down a bit, and add some definition to a uniform. And now with some Reichland Flesh Shade, I'm going to come in and paint all of her skin, being careful not to get this over other areas, just letting it sink into the recesses of her face and her hands. I'm also going to paint any areas we paint with Retributor Armour as well. Reichland Flesh Shade really makes gold details look nice and rich, so it's great for shading over areas of gold. And finally, with some Nuln Oil, I'm going to shade all the other areas of the model. It's going to be areas like her hair and the bandana. I'm going to catch all of the areas we painted with Lead Belcher, as well as the power pack and the cable. All the parts to our armour. I'm going to catch all of this with some Nuln Oil. And also any of the areas we paint with Rhinox Hide. And all the areas we painted black as well. Catch all of these with a shade of Nuln Oil. If you enjoyed the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. If you would like to support the channel and become a member, please press the join button down below. And after those shades have dried, you can see it's really added some definition all over the miniature. Now it's time to start highlighting the model. To do that, we'll start off with the skin. So for this, I'm coming back in with some Bugman's Glow again. I'm going to place this on all the areas that the shade didn't settle. So it'll be all the raised areas of the face, leaving the Reichland Flesh Shade in all of the recesses, coming in wherever the shade didn't settle, and brightening it back up with a thin layer of Bugman's Glow. You can see here where the shade settled into this recess of her arm. So I'm coming in around that shade and brightening all the other areas back up to their brighter colour with a thin layer of Bugman's Glow. And with that Bugman's Glow applied to all the raised areas, we've now got the shadows in the recesses and brightened up the rest of her face. So now I'm coming in with a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone. I'm going to apply this on all the most raised areas in the middle of where we just applied the pure Bugman's Glow. So focus this onto the most raised areas, just apply a little bit of this mix nice and thin in the middle of all the areas that we just applied the pure Bugman's Glow. And with that mix applied, you can see it's brightened up those areas again as we're working towards our brightest highlights. So now with just a bit of pure Cadian flesh tone, I'm going to come in and once again apply this in the areas that we just applied that mix. With this, I'll really focus onto the most raised points, so you can see a bit of all of our previous layers showing through. Just a bit of pure Cadian flesh tone in all the most raised areas and all the highest points. And with the Cadian flesh tone applied, there's just one more highlight colour left to apply to highlight all of her skin. So with some Kislev flesh, we're going to come in and focus this onto all the most raised points as a spot highlight, just to catch the most raised parts of her face and arms. There'll be areas like the nose, top of the eyebrows, bottom lip and chin. There's a little bit here on a pronounced cheekbone on her face. And also any sharp points like the elbow and her knuckles on her hand. And with that Kislev flesh applied, there's all the skin highlighted. So the next step to do will be to paint in the eyes. For this, I'm coming in with some Abaddon Black first. I'm going to sink this into the recesses of her eye sockets, being nice and careful, trying to not get this over any of the skin we've already painted and highlighted. And then with some white scar, I'm going to come in and add a line within that black we just applied, keeping this nice and thin just over that black. And then finally, with some Abaddon Black again, I'm going to add a small line in the middle of that white, which will act like a pupil. With the eyes painted, there's all of the skin and the face painted up. So now the next thing is I'm going to start highlighting all the fabric on the model. So for this I'm coming in with Xandri Dust again. And once again, much like with the skin, just applying this on all the areas that the shade didn't settle, leaving that thinned down Agrax Earth shade showing in all the recesses. So wherever we got some Agrax Earth shade in a recess, coming in on either side, and brightening up the fabric back to its original colour with a layer of thinned down Xandri Dust. By keeping your layers nice and thin, you allow some of that shade to show through. Really helps to build up those transitions as we work towards our brightest highlights. And with the Xandri Dust applied, you can see it's added some definition back to that fabric. So now I'm coming in with a 50-50 mix of Xandri Dust and Deepkin Flesh. I'm going to apply this in the middle of all the areas we just applied our last highlights, focusing this towards the most raised points and edges of all the areas of fabric. Once again, keeping this nice and thin, allowing some of the Xandri Dust to show through on the sides of all of these areas, building up to a nice transition all over the fabric. Just come through and apply a little bit of this on all the raised areas where we just applied some of the Xandri Dust. that 50-50 mix applied, you can see we've brightened up some areas of that fabric, really giving the impression of it catching the light. So now with some pure deepkin flesh, I'm going to come in and apply an edge highlight on all the edges of any folds, like here around her pockets. I'm going to catch the edges of all of these with a little bit of deepkin flesh. I'm also going to catch any of the most pronounced folds and creases, catching these with a thin edge highlight of deepkin flesh. Just focusing this on the sharpest edges and most pronounced creases all over her clothing. I'm also going to do an edge highlight on any sharp areas, like here, the bottom of her tunic. And with that deepkin flesh applied, that is all of the fabric to her uniform highlighted up. So the next thing we're going to start highlighting is her armour. So for this I'm coming in with some War flesh first. I'm going to apply a chunky edge highlight around all of the panels on her armour. Every edge to every panel, I'm catching it with a chunky edge highlight of War flesh. By doing this as a chunky highlight, it allows us to come back in a minute with another colour and really brighten these areas up and add interest to these edge highlights. Don't forget her knee pads as well. You want to catch these with an edge highlight of War flesh. I'm also going to catch the edge of the casing to a bolt pistol with a chunky highlight of War flesh as well. So just take your time, work your way around, pick out the edges of all the areas you paint with Caliban green with a chunky highlight of War flesh. And with that chunky highlight applied, you can see it's made the edges of all these armour panels stand out, but left us space to come back in and apply a thin edge highlight inside them all. So for this highlight I'll be using Warped Stone Glow. I'm just going to apply a really thin edge highlight right along the very edges of all of the panels to our armour, allowing a little bit of that War flesh to show through on either side, really add some interest and definition to these edge highlights. So just take your time, work your way back around the model and apply a really thin edge highlight of Warped Stone Glow and all the panels where we just applied the War flesh. And don't forget the casing to a bolt pistol as well. Also catch the edge of this with some War flesh. And with that edge highlight applied, you can see it's really made that armour pop out and stand out all over the model. So next I'm coming in with some Mournfang Brown. I'm going to start highlighting all of the leather. So for this I'm going to focus on areas that the shade didn't settle on all of the leather pouches and details, and you can apply this a little bit scratchy as you focus it towards the edges and all the raised areas. Apply a scratchy highlight of Mournfang Brown. This will start to give us the appearance of worn leather. So focus it on the most raised areas and towards the edges. Just apply some Mournfang Brown all over the leather. With that Mournfang Brown applied, you can see it's brightened up those areas of leather, but giving it a scratchy, worn appearance. So now with some Mournfang Brown and XV88 in about a 50-50 mix, I'm going to come in and again, in a scratchy pattern, I'm going to apply some of this again towards the edges and most raised parts of all of these leather pouches. You could also focus it onto areas that would get a lot of use, like the tops to these pouches. And in large areas like this, focus it into the middle of where we applied the Mournfang Brown. We're going to work with several colours now to really build up to a scratchy, beaten, worn leather appearance. And with that mix applied, you can see it's really starting to brighten up these areas of leather while giving them the impression that they're well used. Now with some pure XV88, I'm going to come in and again focus this into the middle of where we just applied the previous layer, and also really towards the edges and the areas of the most use. I'm going to put some more scratchy highlights of XV88 into all the areas that we just applied our previous layer. Now, painting leather like this does take a while, but the effect it gives at the end is really worth the time. It can really help make a model come to life. And with that XV88 applied, you can see those areas are starting to brighten up even more as we're focusing towards the edges of all these areas of leather. So now with a 50-50 mix of XV88 and Carrock Stone, coming in and once again applying this right at the very edges of all these areas of leather. Again, keeping this nice and thin, building up in small layers. We're really going to add to that transition of all these colours as we build up towards our brightest highlight on this worn leather. So keep these areas nice and focused, just at the highest points and areas of most use. And finally, with some Carrock Stone, I'm going to come in and apply an edge highlight on all of the areas of leather, just catching the edge with a very thin line of Carrock Stone. And in larger areas here, as well as doing an edge highlight, I'm also going to put a tiny little bit of pure Carrock Stone in the middle of any larger areas that we've been painting. Keep these edge highlights nice and thin, just catch the very edges with a little bit of Carrock Stone. And with that Carrock Stone applied, that is all of the leather painted up. You can see it's really given that worn, beaten look to all of the leather. So now with some Eshin Grey, I'm going to come in and highlight any areas of black. So that'll be here at the tips of her boots and any folds on the boots. Catch these with a really thin line of Eshin Grey. Going to catch this band going around her leg with a very thin line right in the middle. And I'm going to edge highlight her scabbard as well. Make sure you catch any areas of black with a thin edge highlight of Eshin Grey. And with the Eshin Grey applied, that's all the black details highlighted. The model's really starting to come together now. So now with some Steel Legion Drab, I'm going to come in and highlight her hair. For this, I'm just picking out any pronounced strands of hair with a thin line of thinned down Steel Legion Drab. Just make sure you catch the most raised point of any strand with a thin line of Steel Legion Drab. With the hair highlighted, there's only a few more details left to highlight. So with some Celestra Grey, I'm going to come in and highlight her bandana. Much like with the fabric, I'm placing this in areas where the shade didn't settle, leaving some of that shade showing in any of the recesses. With the Celestial Grey applied, you can see it's brightened up some areas to that bandana. Now with some white scar, going to come in and give a thin edge highlight to all these edges on her bandana. Keep these nice and thin, and just pick out the very edge with a thin edge highlight of white scar. And with the bandana highlighted, the next thing I'm going to highlight is the cable to her power sword. For this I'm coming in with some Calgar blue. Just going to add a thin line on the very edge of the cable, just like the light's catching the most raised area. And with some Evil Sun Scarlet, I'm going to come in and highlight the power pack. Just find any raised edges and catch these with a thin edge highlight of Evil Sun Scarlet. With that cable and power pack highlighted, the next thing I'm going to pick out is any Aquillas on the model. So for this, with some white scar, I'm just going to come in and give any of these a thin edge highlight just to make them stand out. So it's this one here on her chest, and she's got one on the scabbard as well. With the Aquila picked out, the last thing to highlight is any of the metallic details. So with some Liberator Gold, I'm going to come in and highlight any areas we painted gold. It'll be an edge highlight all the way around the handle to her sword, and any of these raised details here on the scabbard. I'm going to make sure I pick these out with a thin edge highlight of Liberator Gold. And with all the gold highlighted, the only thing left to highlight now on the model is any of the areas that we've painted silver. So for these areas I'm coming with some Stormhose silver, just going to apply a thin edge highlight to all of the areas we paint with Lead Belcher. So with the very edge of the sword here, catching the edge with a thin edge highlight, as well as this line here down the middle, keeping this nice and thin, nice and even. Many details like here on the power pack, catching these with an edge highlight, as well as all the metallic areas to the bolt gun. Just going to come through and edge highlight all of these areas, just like the light's catching. And with that Stormhose silver applied, there's all of the highlights applied to the model. You can leave it here, but I'm going to add an interesting power effect to her power sword. So for this effect, first one I'm coming in with some Thousand Suns blue. Going to add some lines like lightning strikes up the blade. So just keep adding in some sharp angles to each line have it forking out in different places in an irregular pattern, like lightning shooting up the blade. And with that Thousand Suns blue applied, you can see we've added a lightning strike pattern up and down the sword blade. So now with some Temple Guard blue, I'm going to come in and add a thin line within the Thousand Suns blue we just applied, focusing into the middle all of the previous lines we painted for these lightning stripes, keeping these nice and thin, just focus them into the middle of all of these areas. With that applied, you can see it's added some interest, really given the appearance of electric shooting up and down the blade. And finally, with some white scar, I'm going to come in and apply this as a spot at all of the angles to our previous line. So everywhere we change direction, I'm putting a thin spot of white scar to all of those areas, so it gives the appearance of hot lightning. And with the white scar applied, you can really see it's given the effect of crackling electricity all over the power sword. And with that, that is how to paint Minka Lesk for your Astra Militarum armies. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments down below, what other characters would you like to see me paint? Thank you very much for watching, and happy painting!